For the last 2 months of this lockdown season, I've been telling a series of stories. I'm going back through journals over the last 2 decades where I've been living outside the UK, and I'm telling a series of stories of things that I've been learning along the way. I think this is number 43 in the series, so if you're just discovering this and you'd like to look back at earlier stories, please feel free to. One of my values that I recognise is a life value for me is saying yes to things. It's risk-taking. I've learnt a lot through the things that I've said yes to, and sometimes they've been big risks. I realised though that I wouldn't risk my life for everything. I was reading an article once in Uganda in the newspaper, and it was about a situation in Kenya where someone had the bad habit that probably many of us have, where we take our phone into the toilet for texting, I guess. And anyway, this guy's toilet was a long drop, a pit latrine, and unfortunately for him, his cell phone slipped out of his pocket or out of his hand and fell into the pit latrine. He realised he could pull the lid off his pit latrine, so he pulled it back. He got a ladder and he asked a friend to stand at the top of the ladder, and he went down the ladder to rescue his cell phone. Unfortunately for him, the fumes overcame him and he fell off the ladder. The guy at the top of the ladder saw what had happened and called out to another friend, "Come and help." Climbed down the ladder. He too was overcome by the fumes and fell in. The third guy saw this. He did not learn from the previous two. Sadly for him, he also went down the ladder, and all three of these guys died down this pit latrine for the sake of a phone. So I recognise there are some risks it's simply not worth taking. But having said that, I've learned a lot in my life through taking risks, through stepping out in faith, and through trusting, and I recognise now that these have created, I guess, a foundation in my life. But the interesting thing is that it's almost as if you never fully learn the lessons. You're still always being tested in the same ways and continually having to step out and keep on trusting. This is an interesting life journey we're on. In 2014, we had moved to Spain, and we'd been in Spain for about 6 months. This had been a big move for us as a family of four, settling in a new country, new language, new schools, increased costs, lots of things. And in our first 6 months or so, we were surprised to find how difficult it was. I think we'd thought that moving to Spain was just Europe. It would be easy, much easier than living in Mozambique. In fact, it was far harder in just about every way, which was a great surprise to us. We were also caught unawares by the financial difficulties. Over the first 6 months, 3 different people who had been supporting us regularly for many years, for various reasons, needed to stop giving. Our finances were hard. We were going into debt. We were spending money on the Visa card that we didn't want to do, and it was depressing, it was demoralising, and we began to ask ourselves, have we made a big mistake? Was it a mistake to come to Spain? Is this still our call? Should we look for a job? We were asking these difficult questions. In early 2014, I was invited with 3 other people to go and visit Chad. This was a great opportunity. I was visiting a country that I'd never been to before. Amazingly, the finances for the trip came in immediately. And so I went. Before going, I'd written an email to our prayer group back in the UK, just talking about the challenges that we were facing, particularly our financial challenges. And one of our good friends, who's a real prayer, wrote back, and I'm quoting her here. She said this: "I know you love adventure. This is an adventure of faith and a desert to cross with Jesus as guide. Enjoy his company and the adventure." And she went on, "Losing 3 big supporters is rather daunting, but maybe the Lord knows you were being tempted to look to them rather than to him for each day's bread. Really, transfer your confidence to him rather than what you can see. Even thank him for the test and the confidence he has in you to test you by removing visible means of support." An intriguing response she made to us. Around that time, just before I went to Chad, Miranda and I were reading John 6 together. We were reading the story of the disciples being in the boat with Jesus asleep in the boat while they're in a storm. And the fact that the storm shook them. They were fearful in the storm. We talked as well about Peter in a different episode in Matthew 14, where he walks on the water and his eyes are caught by the waves, and we recognised that we felt like we were in a storm. I love the passage in Matthew 14. I love the fact that Peter is in the boat with the other disciples. He sees Jesus walking to him, and he shouts out, "Lord, if it's you, call me to come to you." And Jesus simply says, "Come." It's as if Peter knew that Jesus had said initially in his discipleship, "Come and follow me and I'll make you fisher of people." And Peter literally felt, if that's him, I can follow, I'll go. I think in the same way, I recognised that we had willingly said to God, if this is you, we'll go to Spain. We'd got out of the boat, if you like. We'd asked God to confirm it, and he had. We'd really felt like coming to Spain was the right thing. It was a good response. And so we'd got out of the boat, metaphorically and literally, and we'd crossed over, and we were now in a new place. And suddenly it felt like we were in a storm, and the waves were coming up, the waves were increasing, and my eyes were on the waves. My eyes were on the fact that our visible means of support was seeming to dry up. I got to Chad, a beautiful country, and I had a wonderful time. I really enjoyed it. It really was fantastic to be back in West Africa and just enjoying it. I remember at the time I was listening a lot to the Hillsong song, Oceans. You call me out upon the waters, the great unknown where feet may fail. And there I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep, my faith will stand. And I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours and you are mine. Being back in Chad really, I think, reminded me of the heart of my calling. I loved it. I felt at home there. I knew I was in the right place. It made me certain, again, I think, that my call hadn't changed. God hadn't brought me on this journey to kind of leave me or to let me sink in water. The place where we stayed for a few days with a team, they had built their base in a beautiful spot. It was in a meander in the river. And so you actually, in the early morning, you could get the sunrise on one side of the river. And then in the evening, if you just went a few hundred metres in the other direction to the other side of the meander, you could watch the sunset. It was a really beautiful place. And so for several days, I watched the sunrise and the sunset over this river. It was really majestic, sitting by the beautiful river, watching the fish eagles swoop down over the river with their haunting cry, seeing the sun setting over the water. And I was listening to that Oceans song many times, just sitting there, listening, meditating, recognising that right now this river looked so calm and still and tranquil. It looked almost easy to walk on the waters. But I knew that sometimes the storm comes in, the wind whips up, the waves pick up, and what looks like tranquil water suddenly feels overwhelming. One day, I was down by the river towards the sunset with one of my colleagues, a friend. I'll call her Jane. And Jane and I began to talk. We began to talk about our life story. And I was really honest with her. I was telling her the struggles that I was having right at this point with finances, with living in Spain. She played me a song by Stephen Curtis Chapman. It's called Take Another Step. It's a song, I hadn't heard it before, and it's simply about taking another step. When you can't see what's ahead, when the waves seem overwhelming, just take another step. And I recognised that's what I needed to do. I played her Oceans, and we sat there listening to the Oceans song, and she was struck by the line, "Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders." And we started talking about that, and I was asking myself, have I been putting borders on my trust? We had a great conversation there, and we prayed together, and I really felt I needed to verbalise and resolve that I didn't want my eyes to be on people. I didn't want my eyes to be on the waves. I didn't want to be caught up by the lack of visible support. Instead, I wanted to really fix my eyes on Jesus, and I wanted to simply take another step. My friend Jane told me a little bit of her story out there. 18 years earlier, she'd actually felt a call to Chad. She'd left her home country and she'd been on her way there with a team, and they'd stopped in France for language learning, and through no fault of her own, the team actually split up and she didn't end up going to Chad. 2 decades passed. Had she lost her calling? Had she missed something? She'd got out of the boat, but the trip hadn't worked out the way she'd imagined. And now, 2 days later, she was here in Chad, in her promised land for the first time. It was obviously a really significant thing for her. The next day after our conversation, the team were going on a trip. We were crossing over the river to visit some friends on the other side of the river, and we were going to cross the river in a dugout canoe, a pirogue. I realised as we were preparing to leave that it looked like Jane was staying behind. I didn't know why. And I said to her, come, are you not coming with us? And for some reason, and it's not my story so I don't know, but for some reason she wasn't going to come in the pirogue. Whether it was negative words that had spoken in the past, whether it was fears, whether it was assumptions, I don't know. But she wasn't going to come. And I sensed that actually maybe she really wanted to. And so I said, why not? Don't worry, it's easy. I've been in dugout canoes loads of times. It's no problem. Come. And what's the worst going to happen? If you fall in, I'll jump in and get you out. And so she came. And she got in the dugout canoe and we crossed the river and we had a wonderful time. And I realised that for some reason in her story, this was a significant moment. This was a moment of trust without borders for her. For her, the question was, am I willing to get back into the boat? For me, the issue was, am I willing to get out of the boat? And having got out of the boat again, am I willing to stay out of the boat? Or am I going to try to climb back in? We're all challenged in different ways. A few years ago, one of my friends wrote a superb blog, and it was called The Minority Report. And in it, she quoted Floyd McClung in his book Follow. And Floyd wrote there are two groups of people in the world, those who have stories to tell and those who don't. Those who are willing to walk on water and those who won't. Those who dare to get out of the boat, like Peter, and follow are the ones who will tell others their stories. And my friend in her blog said that you see these two groups of people in the 12 spies. The majority report came from 10 of them, who saw the giants, who said, we're like grasshoppers. They saw that the waves were too large. They didn't want to get out of the boat. And the minority report came from Joshua and Caleb. They said, we can do this. With God, we can do this. And because of their faith and their trust, they had the chance to live and to prove God. They did overcome the giants in the land. They had an experience of God and a faith story that spoke to others. It's their names and their story that's remembered. Now, as I went through this experience back in 2014 and there in Chad made a conscious decision, I'm going to continue to walk on the waters. I'm not going to allow myself to be distracted by the waves. I'm going to fix my eyes on Jesus. The situation didn't suddenly change overnight. The waves were still there. The finances were still a challenge. It was still a faith stretch, but something did change. It's interesting, I've been walking in this direction for many years now, for more than 2 decades, and yet the tests still seem to come. It's like there's a repeated test, which is part of my repeated growth. I read a beautiful story the other day about someone who went to Stanford, and she was frustrated at the length of the course, and she went to the principal and said, why do I need to do such a long course? And he said, well, what do you want to do with your life? If God wants to grow an oak tree, he takes 100 years. If he wants to grow a squash, he takes 6 months. There are some things in our journey of becoming that take time, repeated tests, repeated challenges, to build up the muscle memory, to build up our deep sense of trust, to build up our muscles. I'm really grateful for these times where I've been stretched. There was something as well about standing by the riverbank and verbalising with someone else, no, I'm going to go on. I am going to take another step. Sometimes I've made those verbal declarations on my own, on top of a hillside. I am going to Mozambique. Other times I've stepped over the line in front of a group and I've said, I am making myself available for leadership, and I've declared something. And there by the river I was declaring, I am getting out of the boat and I'm staying out. I'm not going to allow myself to be distracted by these waves. I'm going to fix my eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of my faith. I realised the power of declaration and the power of doing it in a group and the power of something really sensorial, getting out of a boat, is really significant. And so from that point on, I started taking an inflatable boat into sessions when I'm teaching. And quite often I blow this boat up in the coffee break and I put it out, and we get in the boat one by one, and people take the time to get out of the boat and to declare what they're leaving behind, whether it's fear of people, fear of the unknown, whatever it is. And there's something really significant about these moments of declaration. Our whole body is kind of engaged in this. It's beautiful. This idea of the waves and the boat, it reminded me of St. Brendan's prayer. I'll read it. It's a beautiful prayer. Shall I abandon, O King of mysteries, the soft comforts of home? Shall I turn my back on my native land and my face towards the sea? Shall I put myself wholly yet at the mercy of God? Without silver, without horse, without fame and honour, shall I throw myself wholly on the King of Kings, without sword and shield, without food and drink, without a bed to lie on? Shall I say farewell to my beautiful land, placing myself under Christ's yoke? Shall I pour out my heart to him, confessing my manifold sins and begging forgiveness, tears streaming down my cheeks? Shall I leave the prints of my knees on the sandy beach, a record of my final prayer in my native land? Shall I then suffer every kind of wound that the sea can inflict? Shall I take my tiny coracle across the wide sparkling ocean? O King of the glorious heaven, shall I go of my own choice upon the sea? O Christ, will you help me on the wild waves? I love that poem, that prayer. But there's a repeated refrain, shall I? Shall I? Shall I do it? Will you be with me? And I realise there's a choice. There's a choice that I face daily. Shall I? Will I continue to make a choice? Will I continue to trust? Getting out of the boat is not about faith. It's not about the things that I believe in. It's not about having the right doctrine. It's not what I believe in God. It's trust. It's, am I trusting Jesus in this moment? Are my eyes being taken off him by the waves? Or are my eyes being looking at him? Am I trusting that Jesus is with me in this moment? And as I look at Jesus, what's the look that I see in his face? And even as you hear this, maybe there are situations where you've got out of the boat, where the waves are overwhelming. As you look at Jesus, even now, what do you see when you look in his face? When you hear him say to Peter, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? How do you hear the tone in his voice? Do you hear an angry Jesus? Oh, Peter, you of little faith. Or do you hear the big brother who's watching his little brother, his little sister learn to walk for the first time and rejoicing as they take those first steps before they tumble over, the little toddler falling over, and he picks them up and says, oh, you little thing. Do you hear the joy in his voice? Oh, little faith. Because even when we've got as faith as small as a mustard seed, it's enough to speak to mountains, Jesus said. So as you look in his eyes, what do you see? What's the look as he reaches his hand out towards us, standing there on the waves? Who you hear, the voice you hear, the face you see in that moment is significant. What have you been challenged with today? What's the invitation to you today? Where have you been overwhelmed by the waves? What's the invitation from Jesus to you today? The little boy who shared his 5 loaves and his 2 fishes, he had the chance to participate in a miracle. Peter, being willing to get out of the boat, he had the chance to try to walk on water with Jesus. The 11 disciples stayed in the boat. It's those who get out of the boat, who fix their eyes on Jesus. They're the ones who have the chance to learn something from him. They're the ones who have a story that they can tell.